whole bunch of people in the room. So I'm here to talk about unit testing your Kubernetes configurations using Open Policy Agent. Hopefully that's clear from this slide. If you're not here for that talk, too late. So I'm Gareth Rushgrove. Gareth R, basically everywhere on the internet. I'm now a director of product management at a company called Sneak, doing container and just generally open source software vulnerability stuff. We're in the booth if you want to, in the hall if you want to come see us later. I'm going to talk about I'm going to do a quick introduction to Open Policy Agent. There are a load of really good Open Policy Agent talks throughout the conference. It's one of the CNCF projects. This isn't an introduction. I'll sort of fly through it. Hopefully it makes sense. But I'd encourage you to go to a bunch of the other talks as well. I'm going to talk about testing in the context of policy and enforcement of policy. I'm going to introduce a new tool that I've been building to sort of try and bring these two worlds together. Rego is the programming language that's used in Open Policy Agent. I think it's really cool, but I'm a DSL geek. I'm going to try and convince you all it's really cool and see how that goes. I'm going to talk about portability between different Kubernetes configuration solutions. Turns out different people are using different tools. That's fine. Can we solve some of the testing parts in one go rather than per tool? And also, honestly, infrastructure isn't all, and configuration isn't all Kubernetes. But can we solve even more general problems with one hammer? We'll see how we go. Bunch of live demos, hopefully, if everything works. So, Open Policy Agent. Who's already heard of Open Policy Agent in the room? Lots of hands, but not everyone. That's fine. Who's actually using Open Policy Agent already for things? And a scattering of hands. That's cool. Yeah, Open Policy Agent is really interesting. But what is it? So again, this is a very abridged version of this. But it's described as a policy-based control for cloud-native environments. We need to dig down a little bit more than that. It's ultimately, and how I see it, is it's a language for describing policy against structured data. And we'll show some examples of what that looks like. And it's the engine which you give it your structured data, and it takes that policy and tells you whether that document you've given it is compliant against your policy or basically extracts out meaning. Now that's, again, fairly low level. It's a library which has a whole bunch of use cases. And that's the sort of general take. You'll have some data, you'll have some policy. Open Policy Agent will combine those things together. It's a low-level sort of component to other tools. What's happening in the ecosystem is people are building on top of this. So you're starting to see anywhere where people are saying, we need some policy. Like our software does one thing, but customers need to bring some of their business understanding to it. Like different people want to do different things. Lots of people talk about policy. Open Policy Agent is implementing that in software. That's what that allows is a lot of those times where you've been in a large organization and you've had a policy conversation, and that's resulted in a Word document. Now we can convert that into code. And you're seeing this cropping up in loads of places. Gatekeeper is a really popular project now in the Kubernetes space. It's an admission controller that uses Open Policy Agent. But you're also seeing it in Istio. There's an Open Policy Agent aspect there. And the Ceph project as well, again, has a policy need, and they've been able to plug in Open Policy Agent. It's becoming sort of something that's supported in lots of different places. This is sort of how I think about it and how Vincent thinks about it. It is my new favorite hammer. So you can apply it in lots of different places. The place where I'm most interested in applying it has been in actually testing, as the title of the talk would give you a clue around. And there's this concept of shifting left. And this is how sort of Wikipedia describes it, as an approach to software testing and system testing in which testing is performed earlier in the life cycle. And what that comes down to really is, broadly speaking, you're going to have some workflow, And yes, most of the value is over here in your cluster. But testing things there can be slower. And it's a lot faster today than it was maybe even a few years ago, where you might be like, well, I can ship once every 6 months. Hopefully, you're past that point. But it's still always a bit slower to ship something to your cluster than to test in your continuous integration environment. And having a local, sort of like on your machine sort of environment where you can test even faster is even more useful. And it's not that you don't want like to test over here. It's just that if you can do more tests here, you can be more predictable about testing later. At least around Kubernetes, most of the focus around Open Policy Agent has been over here. It's been testing in the cluster. It's been admission controllers. It's been gating your cluster according to some policy. That's really useful. I think there'll be other talks that will cover that sort of use case in more detail. I'm more interested in, well, what if we could use Open Policy Agent in local environments, in continuous integration as well? I think that's the sort of, the Open Policy Agent being quite a general purpose tool means that it can be, like we can build higher level tools in different places. I was at the CDF, the Continuous Delivery Foundation meeting as part of the sort of wider KubeCon yesterday, and people kept talking about everything as code, as a general movement. And we've got, whether it's been infrastructure, configuration, whether it's been software, we're taking things that were traditionally conversations and people and documents and converting them into software, because then we can have a conversation that is both people, but also computers. And that's true of Kubernetes configuration as a general domain. We've been moving that into, and often lots and lots of YAML documents, but other tools as well. But would you write code without writing tests? I'd say if this was a Java conference, like everyone would be like, well, yeah, I mean, I haven't written any Java without writing some JUnit tests for, I can't remember. Actually, where we are today with the languages that we're building around the Kubernetes API, I would say most people are not writing tests for those things. We don't have the tools or the culture or setup yet. So that's where my new favorite hammer comes in, conftest. So this is a new open source project. It's on the internet. I've demoed it to a bunch of people, but not really shown this many people it at all. So this is all very new. So the basic gist is, well, in a Kubernetes context at least, given a deployment or given any other Kubernetes manifest, but we'll start with a deployment for now. We can write policies about that deployment. Maybe it's just specific to one namespace. Maybe it's specific to your organization. Maybe it's specific to a specific cluster. Whatever it is. We can write policies using Open Policy Agent, and this is Rego code. And if you think about that in the context of, you might have multiple teams using multiple clusters in your organization, but you want to have that conversation about what are the practices we all follow. This is a way of basically describing those in code and then enforcing them at many different places. So Rego is a new language. Some people are going to like that and not. That's fine. But actually, it's reasonably straightforward once you get going. So what have we actually said here? So we've said input is the document I'm passing in. So in this case, it's that the Kubernetes deployment structure. And I'm saying, well, it will have a kind property, and that property will have a value of deployment. So in Kubernetes world, it's a deployment. We're then saying runners not root equals true, not. So basically we're saying if it does not have that value, if it does not have that key, runners root not true, set to true, then we're going to deny. So, and in this case, we're going to put a message saying containers must not run as root. So for those that aren't as familiar with the Kubernetes configuration sort of structure, what that's saying is, If you don't have that flag set, those containers have a lot more permissions on your cluster and might do bad things. It's a reasonably good best practice to, where you can, default to having that set. Here's a way of us actually writing a test to make sure that's the case. And obviously, that's a nice, simple example. You can write quite elaborate policies based on your real-world, real-domain, messy organizational policy structures. Rego is a language that gives you that flexibility. Conftest simply provides you a nice, friendly, local CLI tool to run that. So conftest, test, point out your config that you want to test. In the background here, there's a policy folder with the code we just saw in. You can point it at policy from different places, and there's some other bits and pieces. You can point it at multiple files, and we can test those. But let's see that in action, because everyone likes a quick demo. Let's go the right way. So here I've got a Kubernetes configuration file. We'll show some examples of this with other tools, but we'll start with the basic sort of API wire format, if you like. There's nothing special there. And actually, we've got a number of different policy files in here, and I'll show some of them now, and I'll show a few later. This one is pretty similar to the one I just showed there. We've got a couple of policies. One is doing exactly what we were talking about, which was looking for root containers in deployments and saying, nope, we're not having any of that. The other one is saying, you must have set these two labels. And again, that's a common practice in organizations saying, hey, we've set a bunch of labels and we have tools that look for those that consume that. If you don't enforce that those labels exist, those tools are not going to work. Here's a way of describing that policy in code and having it implemented. We've also got a few other bits in there. Here, again, similarly, and this is a bit of a sort of example policy. This is just simply saying, if there's any Kubernetes services, nope, not having any of that. Obviously, that's not a real-world policy, but it's a nice demonstration. The difference here is instead of being deny, this is warn. And this is really a way of saying, yeah, we've got these policies, but we want to nudge people, not stop them. So I can then do conftest test. Again, I could point it at multiple files. I could do all sorts of different things. Let's just do that one. And that will give me, because that configuration has those problems. So I think that should have. Yeah, you can see it doesn't have that property. So far, so simple. Well, we'll get to some more interesting examples in a moment. But that's the general gist. It's a tool for testing your configuration using Open Policy Agent under the hood and the Rego language to describe those policies. So let's dig into Rego a little bit. Because, again, there's always a barrier to entry when you're faced with a new language. One of the nice things with Rego is actually the documentation is pretty good. It's a domain-specific language specifically for describing policy against structured data. So it's not trying to be everything. It's not a huge language here. And the documentation provided by the Open Policy Agent project itself is actually really good. There's lots of examples, and there's also the under-the-hood details to understand what the syntax is. So definitely check out the Open Policy Agent website and look at the language. I think once you play around with it, and Conftest provides a nice, easy way of playing around with it, it's just one command, you run it against your config and some policy. But if you thought, well, I'm not sure I want to download anything yet, there's the Rego Playground. This is an online website. You can go along to on the Open Policy Agent website. You'll find the links. Here you can just write. You can give it some input. You can give it your policy. And you can see what the output would be were that applied. This is a good way of just sort of experimenting with the language and getting a feel for it and seeing some examples. Again, just from a web browser rather than having to download anything. But it's more than just, yeah, there's some syntax and some policy bits. It is a language, and it is a language with some tooling. So Open Policy Agent has built-in support for actually writing unit tests of your policies in Rego. If you're thinking this is getting meta, you would be correct. Here we're writing unit tests in Rego of our policies in Rego which are testing our configuration. That makes sense, it just sounds weird. So here, actually, we're writing tests against some of those policies. If I pass in a sort of fake deployment here, well, that definitely doesn't have that flag saying don't run your containers as root, and it's going to successfully deny. And you can see more sort of detailed examples here. But that's just built into the OPA tool itself. So then you can just go into your policies, run OPA test, and you'll have a sense of, yeah, not only have we had that conversation about our policies, but we've described them correctly as well. Because often that policy conversation is separate to your usage of your configuration. It's a little bit different to a conversation around unit testing code, where most of the time you're doing that together. This is more the unit testing your policy. You're then applying that policy to your code. Now, but you have a lot more confidence that your policy is correctly described because you've written tests against it. Lots of people complain about DSLs because they lack the tooling. That's not true in the case of Rego. Again, lots of people hadn't come across Open Policy Agent yet or weren't using it yet. And it's an early project, and there's not loads of Rego code on GitHub yet. So this is something that's pretty new, but very interesting to a lot of projects. There's obviously more Rego code that isn't public in different private places. People are using it elsewhere. Sharing public policies is an interesting conversation. But I'd love to see this number explode, because I think there's lots of utility. Open Policy Agent also has a concept of bundles, because it turns out that some of that policy is going to be reusable. And that might be reusable in the context of your own organization. It might be reusable in the context of the policies you're writing that have similar constructs. It has a built-in bundle concept. This is fairly simple. Ultimately, there's a manifest file and there's a tar file, and you can download them. But I think one thing I would love to see as we grow the Open Policy Agent community is sharing these sort of helpers. Things where actually you don't need to become the expert in all the things. You can use a bunch of helpers to get you there. So maybe it's helpers like this of sort of has field. It's really, from a policy point of view, you might want to just check, is something there? Rego has the syntax to do so, but actually we can write abstractions to make that easier to use. Tests helpers as well. They're writing tests that are more expressive. You see this in all programming languages, writing just slightly more expressive versions of things. That's definitely open for sharing. And I think there's a load of potential in, and this is a very trivial example, of sharing domain-specific helpers. And the types of policy, your organization's policy might be different to someone else's. But if we're all working with Kubernetes, the types of things we're probably likely to ask are similar. And so building libraries around Kubernetes or other project configuration, I think, is a really interesting place. And we can wrap all these up with bundles. But one of the things that bundles doesn't have yet is a sort of a first-class concept of sharing. Yes, you can put them on the internet, you could put them on an HTTP server, and there's a mechanism within the OPA tools to download those. But that's not the same thing as whether it's NPM as a registry, or obviously close to all of our hearts, the Docker registries, where we've actually the ability to nearly frictionlessly share things has interesting properties. It becomes very easy for you to get started because you just do, with Docker run thing, and that's downloaded a lot of stuff from the internet someone's packaged. There are pros and cons, but we like that model. The other thing here is that the standards underpinning that have become very widely implemented. So basically at this point, everyone has one or more OCI registries. There are public ones that are like Docker Hub. There are all the main cloud providers have the one that they'll tell you. Everyone has one. If you're on-prem, there are multiple options there. There's the Harbor project within the CNCF. Most of the commercial vendors will give you one. Everyone has one of these registries, and they're broadly speaking compatible. But up to now, we've really only used them for like those Docker images that we run on our like Kubernetes clusters or with Docker. What about using them for everything else? Steve Lasker from Microsoft has been pushing this within the OCI community for a little while. And as part of this sort of, well, OPA would benefit from sharing, like first-class sharing mechanisms. We've set up a bunch of OCI media types for OPA. That's now closed. We've got that done. We're actually demonstrating that with conftest. So conftest provides basically simple push and pull semantics. This doesn't work on every registry yet because of some of the ambiguities around the spec that's getting worked out on the OCI side. But it works with like the open source registry. I think it will work with Harbor that I haven't checked. It works with the Azure Container Registry at the moment. Hopefully in the future, this will work with everything else as well. This is also under the hood how Helm 3 is doing distribution of charts as well. Rather than, again, having yet another registry, let's build on top of what we've already got. So we can actually just have our policy folders, push them to our registries. Other people, and we can pull our own policies, it's not as interesting. Other people can now just do conftest pull, and we download all the right bits. It's early days for this, but it is working today. So. Expanding on that idea, and because this is not specific to OPA, we're just one of the first people to try this out to start with. I think the CNAB folks and the Helm folks are probably the other ones that are experimenting in this area. As of yesterday, Josh Linsley at Microsoft launched Bundlebar, which is basically a front page for a bunch of these sort of media type new package format things, focused on small OCI images for configuration purposes. So this has actually mirrored the Helm charts repository, and also is now starting to get some of the OPA bits and pieces in there. So again, like brand new bits and pieces to play with. Over time, I'd love us to collectively build up like those OPA helpers on Bundlebar or other repositories where we go. So one of the things with the Kubernetes configs is that's the API. Being able to test that is useful. And if you're writing that by hand, then you can use the tooling. But also, we're all starting to use different tools for configuration for different purposes. Having one way of writing tests, I think, is useful because it basically will allow you to more easily move between those tools. So maybe you start out writing a bunch of Kubernetes configs by hand, then you move to like Kustomize, or you move to Helm, or you move to other things, or you're using multiple tools at the same time. You can use Open Policy Agent to describe the test for all of those things. Ultimately, because they compile down to the same config structures. So if you were using Kustomize, well, you can do Kustomize build and pipe the output there. If you're using Helm, Helm template does the same thing. That will render the Helm template as a finished config. In this case, it would be nice to have a Helm plugin that, broadly speaking, does that. There's some prior art around that as well in the Helm community. If you were writing your Kubernetes configurations in Typescript because you wanted a full-on programming language, well, the Kubernetes type module has all of the bits in, so you can do that. And it's easy enough to output that in a structured format that we could then pipe into conftest. My new favorite configuration tool, so I thought I'd throw it in for giggles, is Q. This is, again, another way of describing config with much nicer semantics than YAML or JSON. It's there for authors, not just as a wire format. So you can have more expressive bits and pieces, and you can combine things in different ways. Q also supports the idea of extending the Q command line with the Q language. I said I like meta things. So actually, there's a conftest plugin for Q, so you can do Q test and it will just use conftest for all those things. We can also test our live cluster, because it's possible to get back from, obviously, the Kubernetes API, the documents. It turns out the documents that come back are lists, and you're probably not putting lists in. And so you can absolutely do this if you choose, like nested pipes in Bashisms, maybe not the best approach. Handily, I've been building a Kubernetes CLI, kubectl plugin. It's not actually available in the crew index yet. We're having a conversation with the crew folks about that at the moment. Crew, if you haven't seen it, is a plugin manager for kubectl plugins. There's a talk going on right now about it, which you've missed, but you should catch up on the video on that. Hopefully, we'll get this sorted, but then you can do kubectl conftest. And in the same way as kubectl get, where you'll do, well, type and specific thing if you want, we can test our real cluster. This is a great way of iterating on that policy. So let's see a quick demo of that. kubectl. So here I'm saying, grab me all the deployments and check what's going on. So actually, there was one of the deployments there has containers which do not have that flag on, and the message is telling me which ones. So we can actually point and shoot at a real cluster, as well as use it, say, locally, as well as use it in a CI environment. We can apply all of this in different places. And you can use the same Rego and Open Policy Agent code in Gatekeeper to gate your cluster for new things. We've got, like, it's all very flexible using the same sort of tool set. So, and it's not just Kubernetes. I mean, we can absolutely write policy for our Kubernetes configurations. We can absolutely use it for different configuration management tooling in the Kubernetes space. But config isn't a Kubernetes-specific problem. It's generally computing. So we can actually apply this in lots of places. Having said that, there are a lot of Kubernetes configs around. There are more than 1 million Kubernetes-shaped documents on GitHub. This isn't 100% accurate, but like it's near enough, and that's a large enough number to be very scared of. So well done, sort of. There's actually more than 70 million, or near enough 70 million. That number's probably gone up in the last few days. And again, not all of this is going to be handwritten, but quite a bit of it is. And some of it's generated, and sometimes you want to apply policy against generated code as well. And this is just YAML. This isn't all the other formats that we're playing with. Conftest at the moment supports YAML or JSON as inputs, but that's basically just an implementation detail at the moment. There are issues open to support other formats, whether that might be TOML or HCL or EDN or whatever structured formats we can input into. There's an awful lot of config out there that is probably just YOLO. Having some policy around it would be good. What was I going to demo? I know what I was going to demo. The conftest repo has a load of different examples for different tooling. I won't obviously show loads of different things. One tool that's actually often used alongside other infrastructure tools is Terraform. And some people use it for their Kubernetes configs or just managing their cloud estates more often. Conftest doesn't yet have HCL input, but I'll probably add that soon, or someone can do so if they're interested. Terraform, however, in the latest betas, O12, has basically has set the plan file format in such a way that we can actually access that. So I've got a make file to help me because the commands are a bit gnarly. But all we're really doing here is running Terraform plan, grabbing the output of that. We're doing Terraform show as JSON, then we're passing that into conftest. So we can write policies like these ones. This Terraform code happens to be using the Google Cloud APIs, but I'm banning anyone using Google Container and Google IAM for whatever arbitrary reason. In a real-world context, though, actually, you might be like, no, only certain people or certain repos or certain places can manage IAM things. If you're doing that, then I have a problem, and we will either warn or we will say, no, you need to do that for a different route. So here is a simple blacklist implemented in Rego. Again, there's probably lots of cases where whitelisting and blacklisting is useful. Rego makes that relatively straightforward to do so. You can see this is a bit more of a complex Rego example, but it's not complicated. So if I do make tests, again, all I'm doing there is Terraform show, piping it, outputting that, and then piping that into conftest. Here, actually, our Terraform code is going to change some of those prohibited resources, and I'm going to say, nope, that's a bad thing. I didn't mention before, but the conftest does obviously output the relevant status codes, so you can fail builds and the like. So we can do Terraform config testing. We can do serverless config testing. And again, all these things where, when you start thinking about them there are certain things. There are constraints I want to put on them. If it's a small team, a small organization, those are probably don't need to be in code. As you move into regulated environments, as you move into larger organizations and bits of your organization that isn't as familiar with the tooling, putting some guardrails around things is really useful. You might have compose files and be writing policies around those. Any structured data, I could have obviously gone on for that section for a while. Any structured data, you can write Rego policy against it and have conftest test. So I'm rounding up, and I want to say thank you to a bunch of folks in the open source community. Torin is the person behind Open Policy Agent, and the Styro folks. There's a load of the maintainers around. That project is really interesting and can be used in lots of different places. I just have one specific use case. Steve Lesker at Microsoft drove most of the OCI work, and Josh is doing a bunch of that there with Bundlebar as well. So thanks, open source community. It makes it easier to build things when people will give you feedback and help you along the way. So summarizing the talk parts, Open Policy Agent is really interesting, super flexible. Check it out, even if you're like, I don't want this conftest thing. But check out conftest anyway. It's on the internet. Play around with it, open issues. Let me know what you think. I would expect, predicting things, a load more integrations with Open Policy Agent in the future. I think there's loads of potential for us to have a shared language for policy. I think that's powerful in loads of places. And if anyone else is super interested in tooling around configuration, ping me. I'd love to have more conversations there. I think as a community, we've maybe got good at a bunch of runtime stuff. Service mesh is really interesting. However, we've maybe not built the developer toolchain yet to really, for everyone to embrace cloud native computing. So hopefully you enjoyed the talk. If you've got any questions, if you've got some time, I'm happy to answer, but I'll be around the rest of the conference. If you can't find me after this, I'll probably be around the Sneak booth a bunch. You can go there anyway and check out demos of Sneak, which I didn't cover here at all. But no, thank you all.